Welcome to the Restoring Our City podcast, where we have candid conversations on today's topics to help connect our community. And before we go any further, make sure that you like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff. It really helps us out, and even sending some reviews. That we all love reading them. So please share a review. For those of you who are faithful listeners, I know there's several of you out there. Thank you so much. The feedback, the DMs, all that. Love it. Please keep it coming. Show some love to the pod because we are crazy busy, but we love doing this because this is the only time I schedule time to talk to my friend, Jeswin Thomas, who is on the pod. Jeswin, who did you vote for?
Who did I vote for?
Yeah, no, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I wanted to start off with a firecracker of a question. Not that you have to disclose
like
it.
Illinois, it doesn't matter who you vote for. All the votes are going one way. So I'm just going to put it at that.
Exactly.
So you might make more of a difference down there in Texas. It's purpling a little bit, so your vote might matter.
Yes, your vote does matter. We are not going to get way too political on this pod, but we are going to be talking about government and authority. And specifically, if you've been following along, we've been in this honor series where we've been talking about how critical it is for us to have this characteristic and really this command from God to honor just not only our father and mother, as it says it in the 10 Commandments, but how there is this biblical principle across scripture that we can see about honoring each other. And the reason why we're talking about it is it seems like it's a lost art, right, Jeswin? I mean,
yeah,
I think that it's almost like incentivized, right, to dishonor people. I don't know what you feel like. Isn't social media toxic? And I feel like we beat that drum to death, but
yeah, we definitely beat the drum to death. But I think if there's, again, like we were thinking about honoring your father and mother, then we just talked about church leaders, and you don't really see a whole lot of, potentially dishonor there out in the open very loudly. But when it comes to governments and authority, this is the one that we don't even have to qualify that the dishonor is real. You see it every single day. So let's just get into this. Like, we just need to get into, man, how do we tackle the level of dishonor that there is against any governmental authority and just go from there? Because the other two ones were easy compared to this topic.
Oh, yeah. I feel like we got some good feedback from our other episodes. We talked about honoring just that concept of honor, but honoring our parents, honoring the church leaders and just the church structure itself. But now we come to this big one where it's so blatant, honoring government and authority. And just start scrolling through your social media right now. I bet you have even Christian friends who say some outlandish things about the government and authority. And I think let's start with this question. Can you honor horrible leaders? I mean, let's just put it out there, and we're not going to pull any punches. I think especially in the landscape now, people talk about Trump a lot. We've seen a lot recently, these protests, these No Kings protests, ICE going into cities, and people have very vocal, strong opinions. There's a lot of angst, right, against authority. And I think we can go back in history and see, well, Vietnam, and you can go back wherever, right? Jeswin, like when you think about the temperature of society now, and maybe even the take of society, which is, man, we have horrible leaders. We have governments that may not listen to us or be acting in a politically correct way or even a legally correct way, right? There's lots of different stances, but can you even honor them? Like, why should we tell people to honor people in positions of authority if they're acting so horribly?
Yeah. And I was going to say, I love that you brought up all the stuff with Trump. We're an equal opportunity discriminator here. So we also just want to call out the last administration was horrible, and the administration before that, and the administration before that, all of them. And again, when I say the word horrible leader, what's the face that comes to mind is a good question to maybe pause and think about it. I got one that comes to my mind. I don't know who you're thinking about in your head, Joby. We don't have to say that here on the pod. But when we think about all that, man, can we honor horrible leaders, I guess, was the starting question. And I guess it's not really a question of can we? I think we all have the ability to. But it's almost like, why is everyone seen as horrible? Every single one of the leaders in this long line of presidents was probably viewed as a horrible person, starting with George Washington. I'm sure the Brits looked at that guy as a horrible leader, and now we come to modern days. So it's, it's just been there throughout all time.
So can you honor horrible leaders? I think it's a question that we should ask. But to your point, why do we even see leaders as horrible? Okay, everybody has their opinions on the administration currently and past. And as the elder statesman on this pod, I've been thinking about all the presidents that I've lived through, and it's getting to be a long list. And every single administration season of life that I've been through, there's always been this hyper politicized issue or topic, or society's always had this rebellion against authority, no matter who
Mhm.
it is. So you could be the biggest Trump hater, you could be the biggest Biden hater, or have lots of quips with leaders. But I think generally we're not really talking about what they did. We're just talking about the attitude towards these leaders. I
Yeah.
remember, when I was in high school, George W. Bush was the president, and we went into this war in Iraq, and like September 11th just happened, and the temperature of the country was just so completely against this president. And now I look back and I see like the memes of President George W. Bush, and it's all like these comedic memes. And I think about it, I'm like, wait a minute, don't you remember how everybody was so up in arms against this guy? And now like he's like, oh, he's this lovey-dovey guy, so funny. And I'm like, it's interesting. I'm not talking about the issues, I'm talking about the attitudes towards our leaders, and it changes over time. And
Yeah,
so
but even
I think,
back to George W. Bush and maybe even before him, there was always this concept of no matter who the person was that sat on, the title of president of the United States, you always viewed him as someone that we as all Americans ought to respect. Especially, I mean, think about times like during the Cold War, right? Like
yeah,
there obviously was more of a macro example between a communist and a democratic society. But then you still saw this person as a representative symbol of the American people. And I feel like there was more of a general consensus, disagree or not, that hey, this is a person that we ought to respect and we ought to honor because of what they represent towards all of us. And I think that's been breaking down
yeah,
even to a greater degree now, that it's not about who's in that position. It's just like, well, what side are they on? And depending
yeah.
on where they're at, I will see them as horrible or I will see them as like honorable.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. I mean, I remember when somebody threw a shoe at George W. Bush during a press
That's true.
conference. That's pretty crazy to think
Hey,
about that.
that was not from the American people though. So
Yes, I
there's
know. I
dishonor
know.
from abroad. That's fine.
Dishonor from abroad, but I think it's been de-evolving, right? Ever since. So yes, I think to your point, can you honor horrible leaders? I think from a biblical perspective, yes, we should honor people in authority. I think that might be Captain Obvious to the questions that we're asking here. But I think we want to unpack that, right? Because it's not so easy, especially if you view them as horrible because you disagree with policies and issues of legislation or whatever that might be. But to your point, why are we looking at them as characters of who they are, right? And
Yeah.
basically, we're kind of pigeonholing people based on things that we disagree with and dishonoring them holistically as a person, right? And
Yeah.
I think we need to fundamentally change that type of perspective on people from the get go before we start talking into the topics and the issues that you disagree with, right?
Yeah. I mean, I like that word that you use, caricatures, right? I think when we have, when we always make everything an us versus them mentality, we always tend to blow up, features of the other side. It's like, oh, you're a Republican, you must be a white supremacist. Oh, you're a Democrat, you must be a heathen liberal, right? Like, and you just see again this caricature. I like that the word and that idea of we blow up certain aspects of someone, and so we have a distorted view on them as a person, but we're called again to see them in the imago Dei, but we're seeing them as a cartoon. And
Yeah.
so it's like, how do we maybe get back to that point? What are we exactly called to do? I like at least the very idea that you brought out there, Joby. It's the caricature.
Yeah, no, I think it's something I know we've talked about in different pods, especially when we talk about this like tribalistic culture that I feel like this happened since 2020, probably even before that. There's lots of different, camps that people just live in. And if you're outside of that camp, it's like, okay, I need to disagree with every single thing that that other position holds. And
Mhm.
that tends to have this unbalanced view, especially when it comes to government, right? Like if the past administration did something that the current administration is doing now and it's the same thing, you probably will look at it differently based on who you agree with or who you voted for. And that's kind
Yeah.
of sad to see. And that's where
Yeah.
I think it's hard to have this conversation with non-Christians, right? Because there's no command or mandate for them to honor authority, right? People are going to have their opinions blasted on social media, but what really pains me, honestly, why I'm excited to have this conversation is for hopefully the people that listen to this or see a clip here and there, like they're going to see this. Wait, I'm a Christian. I probably shouldn't talk the way I am talking about authority. Or if I do disagree politically, I need to do that differently because I'm commanded by biblical principles and really in the Bible of how to honor authority, right?
Yeah.
I think that's what we need to unpack.
Yeah.
So, tons of examples in the Bible. I think, Justin, you and I always talk about this stuff before we record, and there's so many examples. It's like, wow, the Bible really shows us exactly what to do and gives us examples of where government probably wasn't the best. And the people who responded in those situations weren't, um, you know, under like the perfect administration. And sometimes they rebelled and they, fought against authority, but they did it
Yeah.
differently than maybe what we're seeing today in today's culture.
Yeah.
So I know we were taking a look at a passage that we wanted to dive into. Romans chapter 13. I know there's a lot of verses to go through. We might not read all of them, but I think it should be a good passage for those of you listening. Go through this chapter and even some of the chapters around it that really speak to how we should have relationships with authority. So, Jessamine, I could start to read a couple verses and then we can start to unpack maybe some of the ideas here, if that works.
Yeah. That works.
Yeah. So Romans 13, and let's start from verse 1, and we'll do a couple verses here. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. And verse 4, for he is God's servant
Mm.
for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. I'll pause there because I don't want to make this sound like, hey, we're talking about like he is God's servant and we're talking about Christian nationalism, or we're trying to ascribe to certain things, or like say, hey, we're talking about specific political affiliations here.
Yeah.
We're really talking about what the Bible says about authority and the concept and relationships of authority. But like I
Mhm.
just read a few verses. I think there's a lot to unpack here. What's your first take, just kind of on an observation level, Jeswin?
Yeah, I mean, I like how this entire thing started. It just straight up says, "For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." And even in verse 4 that you sort of ended off with, it calls the people that are in authority God's servant. It
Mhm.
says it multiple times that it's God's servant. And maybe I'll add one more verse that you ended off in verse 5. It says, "Therefore,
Yeah.
one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience." So there's this idea of the person that is in authority is one, instituted by God, two, is seen from God's perspective as his servant that yields his sword of justice in this life. And three, it calls the believers to say, hey, if you want to avoid the wrath of God, you have to be in subjection to this governing authority. Now, we read those things and it's like, well, who is it talking to? It's talking to people that are currently under the authority of the Roman Empire. So let's put some context to this. I would not call Caesar the servant of God, right? I would not call Caesar the person that is giving good laws that we should follow and also punishing bad laws. In fact, some Roman emperors burned Christians at the stake, for being a Christian. They don't seem to be doing some of the things that's being talked about here. So almost like I see on one side the biblical mandates, but two, I might see a little bit of contradiction here as well. It's like, how do I hold both of these things in tension? I don't know if you have any responses or
No,
ideas on that.
thank you, Jessamine, because I feel like even if we post a clip or something like that, people are going to look at that and be like, are you calling Trump a God's servant? And is Trump a Christian? And that's the tagline, right? Like, well, no, let's talk about the Bible and for what it says and who it's written to in that time and
Yeah.
unpack what it really means for us today, right? Like true Bible study, right?
Yeah.
But I'm glad that you unpacked it because we could see so many parallels and people have, and I don't want to diminish people's concerns with rulers and authorities and issues that they fundamentally and wholeheartedly disagree with. I think there's some validity to that, right?
Yeah.
But the way that we disagree and the way that maybe we even, to your original question, view leaders as this cartoon of evil or good and the savior, right? Like we need to
Hmm.
stop doing that because we shouldn't be viewing people this way, but really understanding the dynamic of who put them there in that position of authority. And I love how this chapter starts out. But you and I were talking about this before and just the context of even just this chapter, right? I don't want to steal your thunder. Can you let us know, like, what, for the people who are wrestling with this and feeling angst of like, man, I don't want to be subject to an authority. Like, what if they're horrible? I have every right to fight against that. And I
Yeah.
need to do that. Like, what would you say to that person reading these verses?
Yeah, and again, context is key, right? So there's this idea again of a chiasm, or almost like a sandwich, right? It's like, hey, the Bible told us some very hard things about being subject to authorities, and it's telling it to a people that were being brutally crushed by the
Yeah.
authority that they're subjected to. But what does it say before chapter 13, and what does it say directly after verses 1 through 7 in chapter 13? It starts off with the end of chapter 12. It says, again, bless those who persecute you, and blessed and do not curse them. That's in verse 14. God is also saying this in verse 19 as well. It says, don't never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it's written, vengeance is mine and I will repay, says the Lord. So yes, it talks to the believer and says, hey, if you're not subject to authority, God's wrath is on you. But it also says to the persecutor that, hey, vengeance is mine and you are also subject to my wrath when you persecute my people. But at the end of the day, what is still the call to the believer in verse 21 of chapter 12? It says, do not overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So there is still a call to overcome, be subject, and show love. And even after verses 1 to 7 in chapter 13, verse 8, it says, oh, no one anything except love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. So it is very hard things to hear, but don't also forget that God is saying, if there is someone that is truly horrible, that is persecuting you, vengeance is mine. And that day is coming. That judgment day is a warning to those that are in authority that are persecuting those that God loves.
Yeah, man, and it's so applicable, right? It's so relevant to today. And I see the protests. I see all the stuff in the news, and I think there's a way to do it. I think the violence and that kind of thing doesn't really work or get your point across. But when we do have disagreements with authority, I think we just have to disagree better as Christians
Mhm.
because the way that this is talking about submitting to authority, but then also putting into context who's really in control. So we're really losing that perspective of who our leaders are and who's actually in control of, in light of the timeline, right? Like to me, what I think about is like the civil rights movement, the peaceful protests, sit-ins, people who literally would sit and have people mock them or hose them down with water and not repaying evil for evil, but repaying evil, overcoming evil with good, right? And having
Mhm.
that kind of perspective. There's a different type of attitude that a Christian can have when they don't agree with authority. And I think we've got
Yeah.
to portray that better. And that's how we can be less dishonorable and actually more honorable, right?
Yeah. And maybe this is a totally different episode, but that term Christian nationalism, I know it's tossed around a lot today. But
Sure.
if you really think about the civil rights movement, it was fueled by people that were very biblically based and taking that into the streets, calling for the country to reflect those values. So, some ways it might be a Christian nationalism that caused the civil rights movement, but I digress
Yeah.
on that point. Totally different episode, totally different day that we
Yes.
will get to it as well. I think the second thing I did want to say, Joby, you brought that up, that the way that they disagreed was different, and bringing up that practical example of the civil rights movement. It's interesting here. It was in verse 2 that you read in chapter 13. It says, therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who will resist will incur judgment. The thing is, when I think about the Bible and I think about examples, there's so many examples of people that resisted
Yeah.
authority. Obviously, two of the ones that come to mind are Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. and being thrown into the fiery furnace, and Daniel in the lion's den, right? In both of those cases, again, we have to look at the Bible holistically. If we just took this verse out of context and said, hey, if you resist all authority, you're just going to be subject to judgment, that's not exactly what the Bible is saying, too. It says, as long as there isn't something that's violating a biblical mandate, such as worshiping the Lord your God fully, in the cases of Daniel and in those examples that we saw, in those cases, there was a resistance that they put up, and they were still subjected to the authority of the emperor of Babylon, and they suffered for what they were called to do. Now, it doesn't seem like they pulled a revolution in order to change the law. It doesn't seem like they did anything aside from try to faithfully follow the authority and honor them even in their disagreement, but they were subjected to some penalties, but they still did it in a way that I think didn't incur the wrath of God on their life for violating the honor of the authority that he placed in that
Yeah.
time. I don't know if other examples come to your mind.
No, I think it's interesting. We talked about honor, and I think I put a clip up on TikTok somewhere, and somebody had a comment about honor, and I responded about even the verse in First Peter where it talked about honor everyone, honor the emperor, and I
Right.
was just thinking about the context of how Peter even wrote that, and he wrote that
Yeah.
at a time where Nero was the emperor, and Peter's writing, honor the emperor. And it's so interesting when you read about Nero, if you are not a history nerd, but it's like he was one of the most evil emperors ever. And he was notoriously evil and did horrible things in persecuting people. And Peter had the gall to say, honor the emperor. And it's almost like we think of honoring authority as aligning with their views. And I think that's it's just a fundamentally wrong way to think about honor, right? When we're bestowing value, because we're not thinking about who placed them in those positions of authority. And I
Mhm.
think if we start to characterize um, our leaders as something other than the image of God, you might fundamentally disagree with some of the issues, but then you are almost disavowing the fact that God is sovereign. And
Yeah.
I hate to make it so superlative, but it's like, man, you think about the context of your life and like who's putting these leaders. And that's why I go back to all these administrations that I've seen. I'm like, man, you're always going to disagree with somebody, right? But think about your place in time or where God has placed these people for such a short period of time, but ultimately he takes vengeance, like you read in the context. So I think we just have to understand honor in the grand scheme of things, that God is kind of playing not just pulling the puppet strings, right? But he's sovereign.
Yeah.
He's dictated the timeline here.
Yeah, and even again, when we're talking about commands and mandates toward us, again in verse 8, which or verse 7 that we didn't read, that it says, pay to all what is owed to them. He talks about taxes, revenue, but the last two things outside of money, it says respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. Well, the question is, to whom is it owed? Ultimately it's to God's servant, because that is a reflection of our honor toward God himself, who is calling us to respect the authority, right? And again, like you brought up that example of Peter and Nero, seems completely unfair. Same thing that we would say maybe about Saul and David, right? Saul was placed in that position of authority. Of course, God will remove him from that place and give that place of honor to David. But as Saul is pursuing David to try to kill him throughout that entire ordeal, David does not take vengeance into his own hands,
Yeah.
even though he had the opportunity. And even after Saul dies, someone comes to David, and I forgot the exact episode. I forgot what they brought. I think it was like, hey, I killed people that were on the side of Saul or something of that nature. I forgot what exactly the context was. But David looks at that person and it's like, hey, you did something dishonorable toward the servant of God. He still viewed that position as one that merited honor, and he takes vengeance as the king with the authority and essentially eliminates them, right? So there is this question of who is honor owed toward? How do we see that position? I think David's a good example. Peter's a good example of how they view the position. But ultimately, again, our mandate is give honor to those whom honor is due. It's due to the Lord and also to his servant, those that he has placed in power above us.
Yeah. And I think that's a great example too. And it's like throughout scripture, there's this wrestling with authority. And it's almost like there's this disjointed connection with them. But as we look at this passage, and even just thinking about our series, right? We started talking about honor. Why is this so important? And as you mentioned, it's a command. It's in the 10 commandments talking about honor your father and mother in the 10 commandments. And that really spoke to, and the reason why we started off with that specific, relationship in the beginning was because from the beginning of our lives, the authority over us is our parents. And if we don't know how to honor them, we're not going to ever honor any other person in that relationship to us. And I think
Yeah.
the relation part is lacking, right? And I think that's where this passage kind of unpacks that a little bit, right?
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah.
And
And
I think it's almost easier again, like with these contexts of trying to honor our parents, honor our church leaders. They are people that we might find easier to honor. But when you get to something like the government and the climate that we see it today, and throughout human history, right? Like we just talked about the Roman Empire. We talked about Saul and different kings that did some horrible things. We talked about Babylon as well. These are not great examples of good government.
right.
They're examples of evil empires, right? And I might go on a little bit of a tangent here, but let's think for a second. When Jesus was here on the earth, one of the phrases that he used to identify himself was Son of Man. Do we know where the term Son of Man comes from? It's only used in one other place in the Bible. It's used in Daniel. And if you go to the passage and it's in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 7, it starts off with Daniel seeing a vision of these four beasts. There's these hybrid creatures. It's like a bird with like a leopard face. It is like a bear with like goat horns, all these hybrid beasts, right? And each of these beasts represents a human empire. When God looks at human empires, he is seeing these unnatural, predatory creatures. And that's sometimes how we view our own governments, unnatural, predatory creatures. That is an accurate description that the Bible gives to human empires. Governments are good, they're here to maintain authority. Empires and the evilness that comes with it is what the Bible describes as, and again, even in Revelation, a beast with 10 horns. Why is it always these predatory creatures
Right.
that the Bible talks about when it talks about human empire, right? And that's exactly how we see it today. However, when it says, you know, Daniel gets a vision of the throne room of heaven and he sees God and the Ancient of Days coming there, and he takes the power away from these human empires. And who does he give it to? It says, and I saw one that was coming like the Son of Man. Here is someone that is going to have the government on their shoulders, that is going to reflect the humanity with which the government ought to be run. And that is
Hmm.
only in Jesus. And Jesus is saying in the New Testament, I am that person. All these human governments are going to fail you. They are going to be predatory. They're going to be evil. We get that. We're still calling you to be subject to them, just like I called you to be subject to Caesar when I was here. But at the end of the day, the only time the government is going to reflect the flourishing of human society is when it's given to one that will rule like a son of man. When Jesus took that title, it is a very governmental title that he's taking and alluding to. So if you want some context on that, go back to Daniel chapter 7. And we, again, me and Joby agree with you. All these governments suck. And
Yep.
until the Son of Man comes, that's the only government that's going to be great.
I don't think that's a tangent because I think that's a great way to connect the dots here at the end of Romans chapter 13 is because we've lost the humanity when we talk about relationships. And Jesus almost restores that in that beautiful soliloquy that you just said, where he kind of described that. He brings the humanity back to it. And at the end of the day, what I feel like this passage is talking about is relationships. And that's fundamentally why we have a problem with honor, is because we have a problem with relationships. And
Yeah.
when we talk about the commandments, we started off this series talking about the commandments. But then you look at Romans 13 and it's actually references the commandments in verse 9 for the commandments. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not covet. And any other commandment are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. It's
Mm,
almost like, wait a minute, right at the end of this, when he tells us to be subject to authority, and he brings it back to fulfilling the law, which is loving your neighbor. We do not look at our government as our neighbor, probably big brother. because of NSA or whatever you want to think about, right? But there is this I'm not saying you have to like befriend all of your senators and your local aldermans or well, this kind of stuff. But like, isn't there something lost? Because if you really knew that person, would you characterize them? Like, think about all right,
Mm.
Trump is the big issue, right? Like people have a problem with the president and you're not my president. I'm like, well, I mean, I always find those arguments a little silly. I'm like, did you change the law specifically for you? And I'm not like trying to play any sides here, but I've heard that for every single president as long as I've lived, right? But it's just like one of these things where if you knew that person, and I'm not saying that would make that person good or bad, but
Sure.
personal relationships typically make us humanize people more, and we don't end up being so dishonorable. You could totally disagree, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but you don't have to dehumanize people because I don't think that ever helps your argument. It doesn't actually
Yeah.
further your cause. It actually hurts it, especially if you identify as a Christian, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And just like you said, right? Like the humanization of people, it is something that is unnatural to us, right? Like, this is a very unnatural thing to do. But again, if we think about that idea that Jesus one day is coming as a son of man, in some days we look forward and it's like his kingdom is coming, but at the same time, it's already been inaugurated. It's also already here, right? It started
Yeah.
at his first coming. It's living through his kingdom people and will one day be ultimately fulfilled when he returns. So the question is like, are we living as kingdom people in contradistinction to what is naturally occurring in this world? And sadly, I think our conclusion as a church is like, no, we're not. We are
Yeah.
failing on this. We are playing into the dehumanization you just talked about. We are playing into what's happening on social media and what we've been posting. We are playing into how we're just going with the flow of the dishonoring of our authority. We are not living as the kingdom people God has called us to be, especially in this idea of honoring governmental authority.
Yeah. And I think that's a great way to think about the practical way that we can live this out, right? It's like
Yeah.
got all these issues with authority. We are a dishonorable society. So what do we do about it, right? Especially if you are a professing Christian. Yeah, I would almost challenge you like, who's actually in charge? Who do you think is truly in a position of authority? Do
Mhm.
you actually believe that the kingdom of God is here on earth now? Are we living through this right now? Like, do you really feel that God has placed people in positions of authority even when they do things wrong, right? I
Yeah.
think we have to fundamentally ask ourselves these questions if you're a professing Christian, because in the way that you believe the answers to those questions will dictate how you live it out to really fulfill the law as it says
Yeah.
in Romans 13 to love your neighbor. And I think that's where we have to shift our perspective from authority to neighbor, right? Like if we
Yeah.
keep thinking of people in authority as always bad, like all cops or all people congressmen or everybody's corrupt. We just bucket people into these groups and we don't look at people as neighbors, then we will always have a problem with authority, no matter who that person individually is as the image of God.
Yeah.
Right?
And at the same time, you said everyone is corrupt. I agree. Everyone is corrupt, including
Yes.
myself, including yourself. We are all
Yeah.
corrupt. We need to put on the incorruptible. And so
Yes.
even seeing the corruption within ourselves is where it should start, not always seeing the corruption in someone else. But at the same time, talking about practicals, how do we actually do this? I think that's part of the problem. If we just look at the dehumanization that's going on, we're not actually talking about policies anymore, right? Like we're not talking about ideas that we want to articulate and talk about and say, hey, is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea? Well, if this is a bad idea, I need to vote for someone that has a better idea. That's not how we think about government, how we talk about policy anymore, but that's exactly what a democratic society should be. So, maybe the next time we have a political conversation, let's make it less about if we like or dislike the individual, more about, well, what exactly are they standing for in terms of a policy? And I think there's a good quote from, I think, Allie Beth Stuckey. One of the things she always says from her own podcast is, policy matters. Sorry, politics matters because policy matter because people matter. Because at the end of the day, policies impact people. Therefore, we should care about politics. I'm not saying let's go live as nomads until Jesus returns. No, there's
Right.
impacts we can make through the political system. And we understand at the end of the day, it's not always about if we dislike or like a person, but we think more about if they got into a position of power, what policies are they signing? Because that has a direct implication and impact on my life, on your life, on this nation's life, and on our neighbor's life as well.
Yeah, and I think it's refreshing when people see you as a Christian. I think we've talked about this on our pod before, especially if, like, talking to people at work or in the grocery store, and the way they converse with you, you can almost tell sometimes when somebody's a Christian. The way they
Yeah.
behave, the way they talk, the way they care, right? And I think they'll know we're Christians by our love. And I think if we fail to do that in our verbiage, in the way that we even put forth our ideas or our disagreements with political issues or topics or even authority, then we're not reflecting Christ really. And I think it goes back to this concept of honor, because if you can't honor authority, how can you honor God? Like, how do you actually show God the ultimate esteem and the ultimate glory? So we go unpack this word, as we've talked about in a couple episodes before, the meaning of honor, to bestow glory and the weight and
Hmm.
value to a person, not just because I disagree with one sliver of who they are or what they believe in, but because of who they are holistically. And that's what honor that we should even be doing towards each other and authority and in our relationships. And I think we have to start to ask ourselves, the way that you comment on stuff on social media, I think we have to be accountable to it. But it's not just because it makes you look crazy, but it's probably because you have to ask yourself and be self reflective of, wait, how am I treating God? Do I
Yeah.
show God, who put this person in power, any kind of honor whatsoever? And I think
Yeah.
that's a convicting type of question that we might be able to ask ourselves.
Well, and I think about, again, think about like Judgment Day. Again, we talked about that idea of God's wrath, being subject to God's wrath if we don't honor these commandments. Like, you can only imagine, God one day on the day of judgments, you before the Lord, and it's like, hey, how did you honor authority? And he just pulls up your Instagram, your Twitter, your whatever you want to like pull it up. And you look at the words you use, the things you reposted, the things you shared, and the level of dehumanization and demonization that might be in there, right? Again, you just read a verse like verse 5 of chapter 13 of Romans. It's therefore one must be in subjection, not only to avoid wrath, but also for the sake of conscience, right? I like this idea for the sake of your own
Mm.
conscience. What does it say when we don't even feel bad about some of the things that we're doing on social media because we feel like it's a disconnected reflection of us? It's like, no, it's a direct reflection of you. And if it's not pricking your conscience, to what degree have we bludgeoned it that we can no longer feel? How hard is our heart that we
Yeah.
don't even feel the pricking, the Holy Spirit talking to us to be like, hey, is this something in line with what the character of Christ would be and how we're utilizing social media to use words to communicate to the world? It's really a question that we should be asking ourselves.
Yeah. And I know we live in a society that it's rewarded when you behave in the
Mhm.
extreme, right? And that's
Yeah.
I'm sure we were talking about it today, right? Like, what's the most clickbaity thing you could put as a title to make everybody watch this? Or we could AI generate any kind of image, right, to put as the cover art for this episode, right? But the thing
Yeah.
is, like, we could do all those things, but is that really reflective of who Christ wants us to be? And maybe not everybody's going to see that. And now it's not going to grab everybody's attention. But really, what's going to shift the atmosphere is the relationships that you have with people. You might get a temporary uptick in you might get some more likes and views or whatever it is. But the thing is, what's really going to move the needle, like when you talk about how we treat each other, if we really want to change policy, like the way that we treat each other and having that value of honor towards everybody, even the people that you disagree with, I think that goes a long way. Look at the example of Christ. And then I think we talked about it before. Even Paul arguing his way, even to get to Rome, like going through the legal system, like they threw him in jail. How many times, right? There's so many great examples that the Bible shows us that we don't have to put up with injustice, right? But we can
Yeah.
go against it in the right approach and in the right ways.
Yeah. 100%. I like that idea of Paul's legal system again. Like every single time he's in trouble, it's like, y'all realize I'm a Roman citizen, right? And he
Right.
will appeal to Caesar in
Pull that
order
card.
to Yeah, he pulls the Rome card. That's great, right? Like, I would love to pull the American citizenship card abroad one day. It's like, y'all realize who you're messing with, right? Like, but
Yeah.
you know what? I probably is going to be dishonored when I go
Yes.
abroad and pull.
Be careful with that one, right? You got to hide your passport sometimes when you're abroad. But
Uh,
honestly, I think it's a hopefully it's a convicting episode for some. If you are listening to this and you say, "Hey, I do have really strong opinions on the state of the country and what's happening with authority and like understanding all of that." But the way that we approach it and voice our displeasure or disagreement has to be honorable because I think when we look at what the Bible says, that's the way to overcome what we might perceive as evil. And that might be subjective, right? Depending on how you look at certain issues, but that's not what we're talking about. How do you overcome evil?
mm,
You overcome evil with good. And how do you treat your neighbor? The ultimate commandment, right? It's all right there. And I think we just need to practice that a little bit better.
yeah,
So
100%. And even with the neighbor again, like we have Democratic neighbors, we got Republican neighbors, we got Green Party neighbors, right? And now in New York, you might have some socialist neighbors too. Like we have to honor all of them collectively. And when we think about even as a church, right? I think one of the maybe the litmus tests that we have to at least ask ourselves is, yeah, we talk about this concept of diversity, and that's something that I believe our churches should reflect in some senses, whether it's coalition building or within the church itself. But even when we think about our intellectual diversity, is that coming to a point where, we might walk into a space and be like, "Oh, man, this is just a conservative church," or, "Oh, man, this is just a liberal church," or, "Oh,
yeah,
man, this is just a" it's almost like does our sub-identities does it start overarching and becoming our primary thing that we're identified by rather than being a Christian first? Like, man, like, I just think about our society today and how different we ought to be, and it's like, man, if the Christian community could just get this right, that we are brothers and sisters no matter what, and we can
mhm,
model to the world what humanizing disagreement looks like, and we could really shift and tone down the temperature of not just this country, but get back to a healthy place that I feel like we've lost. But if we can't do that as a church, like I truly believe the nation's screwed. There's no other way
yeah.
to put it.
No, no, it's fun. There's so much to unpack there, and I think there is a climate now where people are attaching themselves to Christianity almost to further a political cause because it might be trendy now, right? And now I see that so much on social media from people I never would have thought would be ascribing to Christian values. I'm just like, wait, there's some guy who's partying all the time and throwing crazy videos on TikTok, but then it's like they're praying now. And it's like, wow, I really found my faith. I was like, wait, what? Never would have seen this. But then you start to see this association in the political realm too. And it's hard to unpack, right? And I think that's where people wrestle with it too to say, hey, are you just tacking on Christianity for your selfish
Mhm.
gain?
Sure.
Or, I think to your earlier point, people and policy and we need to ensure that we care about these things and not to completely separate things, but let's care about what's happening in our positions of authority in government because it does ultimately impact people, right? We can't
Yeah.
just segment ourselves from it.
Yeah, and maybe that's the tangential episode that we should do. Is if you want us to do an episode on Christian
Yeah.
nationalism, go ahead and do it. Do what we said at the beginning of the episode. Like, subscribe, leave us a comment or review, and we'll probably want to dive into that one because that would be an interesting one to tackle.
Yes. Yes. We'd love to kind of talk through that. I know we did it a few years ago, like 2020. We started talking a little bit about it, like America founded as Christian principles. I remember you talked about that a little bit too, but probably have to dig up that old clip. But yes, please send us messages. Let us know what you want us to tackle through. But loved talking through this series. Would love to hear your feedback, especially on this episode too. And if you disagree and you fundamentally disagree, have at it in the comments and send
Yes.
us a DM. But thank you, Jeswin, for sharing your wisdom. And this was such an honorable episode. Like we didn't tear each other's heads off, or you didn't tell us who you voted for. And so, spoiler alert, he didn't tell us. Sorry, guys. But hopefully, we can kind of come to an agreement and be more civil and see an honorable society. But thank you, guys. Look forward to talking to you on the next episode.
Peace.